بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Inshallah, we have about 10 minutes before we start Salah, so we'll at least get started, inshallah ta'ala. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he is now hitting the 40-year marker of his life. And as we come closer to that 40-year marker, there are many introductory moments that occur for that revelation of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that first revelation, that Iqra. And there were a significant amount of openings that occurred that were much more frequent to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So for example, there's a narration in Sahih Muslim where Jabir ibn Samura radiallahu an, he says that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Inni لا أعرف حجرا بمكة كان يسلم علي." That I recognize this stone in Mecca which used to say salam to me before قبل أن أبعث إني لا أعرفه الآن. That before my advent as a prophet, and I can recognize that stone even now if I go to Mecca and see it now. And there's another narration in Tirmidhi where Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Ali radiallahu an, narrating it, that he was with the Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam in Mecca. So obviously he's a kid at this time. And he says, we did not pass a stone, a rock, or a mountain without that object or that creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saying salam to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this is part of the long preparation of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam receiving revelation for the first time. As we've mentioned multiple times in this class, him receiving revelation wasn't a shock. He knew it was coming. He knew something big was coming. He just didn't know what was coming. And so Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he received first revelation at the age of 40 years old. Aisha radhiallahu anha describes how this revelation occurs. She says, أول ما بدأ به رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم من الوحي الرؤيا الصالحة في النوم. That the first thing that occurred by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in terms of revelation was that he started to experience true dreams. الرؤيا الصالحة. Now this is very beautiful. Where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala places this miracle of seeing true dreams in the life of the Prophet ﷺ at this time, because it's to ease the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ into the unseen world. He started communicating with the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ through dreams so that he trusts what's going to happen later on. So that he trusts his own mind. So that he trusts his own sanity. That this is all in line with everything that you have been seeing. So what would happen, and also another point, is that you don't just drop responsibility on someone. إِنَّ سَنُلْقِي عَلَيْكَ قَوْلًا ثَقِيلًا. That surely this revelation, it's heavy. It's heavy responsibility. So this heavy responsibility can't just be dropped on someone. You have to be prepared. You have to be ready. You have to receive the training. You have to, have the capability, have the understanding. So this is all part of the reasons why true dreams was a great way to ease Rasulullah ﷺ into this wahi. Now the scholars say that dreams fall into one of three categories. There is hadithul nafs. So hadithul nafs are the type of dreams that it's just an everyday type of dream. So there's a famous example where you have like a hifz kid, and the hifz kid is like reciting Quran all day, and then in his dream he sees himself reciting Quran, and it's like, okay, you were doing that all day, right? Or many of you folks, maybe you've been coding in your dreams. That's hadith al-nafs. You're coding all day at work, and then you go to sleep and you find yourself coding in your dream. There's not really any interpretation to these dreams. It's just, it's a culmination of your day. It happens. It's in your thought. It's in your brain already, so it may appear in a dream. Then there's adghathul ahlam, or also can be translated as nightmares. If there's an English translation for it, it would be nightmares. So, the Aziz al-Misr, during the time of Yusuf alayhi salam, right? He had a dream, and the advisor told him, قَالُوا أَضْغَاثُ الْأَحْلَامِ. This is just a confused type of dream, a nightmare type of dream. There's no interpretation for anything like this, right? So adghath al-ahlam. And then there's, by the way, if you ever experience a nightmare, what are we supposed to do? Rasulullah taught us some ways to either prevent a nightmare, or if you wake up from a nightmare, you read the ta'awudh, a'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem, and you would spit dryly to your left side 3 times, right? And if nightmares continue, then that means we need to be more punctual with our du'as before we go to sleep. So ayatul kursi before going to sleep, the 3 quls before going to sleep, qul huwallahu ahad, qul a'udhu rabbil falaq, qul a'udhu bin nas, being punctual with that, going to sleep with wudu, right? The last 2 verses of Surah Al-Baqarah before you're going to sleep, right? So these things will help keep adghath al-ahlam, or confused dreams or nightmares away, inshallah ta'ala. And then the final is something called ru'ya salihah or sadiqa. And this is where the scholars say this is min juz al-nubuwa, right? This is a portion of prophethood. So this is what the prophets would experience, and many pious people experience this too. That's why it's a portion of prophethood. It doesn't mean that if you see a true dream, it means you are a prophet, right? That's not the case. It just means there's a portion of prophethood, right? My grandma, Allah yahfadha, she's like this. She doesn't dream very often. But when she dreams, something happens, right? So there was one time recently, actually, where my cousin was pregnant and nobody knew. And then she had a dream that my cousin was pregnant, and so she told the whole family she's pregnant without even consulting her first. And then she was like, how'd you know? She's like, I saw it in a dream. And it just happens, subhanAllah. Like, there's people that are just like that, MashaAllah. Now, when it comes to true dreams, the Prophet Muhammad said there are some guidelines with this, right? First, Rasulullah told us that the most truthful of dreams occur in the last third of the night, right? Because this is when people are usually in their deepest part of sleep, which is why it's so rewarding to get up in the last third of night to pray salah, tahajjud, right? The best time to pray tahajjud salah is in the last third of the night. Why? Because it's the time where most people are in the deepest point in their sleep. So it's the hardest time to get up in the night, which is why it's so rewarding. And Rasulullah also says those who are most truthful in the day will see true dreams at night. SubhanAllah, it's a sign of sidq, a sign of truthfulness, someone that sees true dreams. Now, with that being said, something that is important to note here, true dreams or good dreams or dreams where somebody sees Rasulullah in a dream, all that is good, it's positive, but they're not a hujjah, right? They're not a proof for something, right? So if somebody says, the correct opinion is this because I saw it in a dream, it's like, okay, Habibi, good for you. Okay? It's good for you. Like, you can follow that if you want, but that's not a hujjah. Because we can't what? Like, we have to think logically here. Sharia can't substantiate your claim. So because we can't substantiate your claim, we're not going to take it as a proof. Now, if someone claims, I saw Rasulullah in a dream, and he told me to do this, right? Therefore, everybody has to do it. You can do it. You can do it, but not everybody has to do it. That's not how Sharia works, right? We can't substantiate that dream. We couldn't see that dream ourselves. We have no evidence of that dream. So therefore, dreams, even true dreams, take it as a good omen, a good sign. But it's not a proof. It's not a proof. Wallahu ta'ala alam. Anyways, we'll pause here, inshallah, and then we'll pray salah, and then we'll jump right back into it, inshallah ta'ala. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Salatu wassalamu ala Rasulullah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. قال الله تعالى في كتاب العزيز بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. So continuing on with Aisha radiallahu anha telling us about the Prophet Muhammad sallam's steps to revelation, where she says at first he saw true dreams. Then she explains these dreams and she says فَكَانَ لَا يَرَى رُؤْيَا إِلَّا جَاءَتْ مِثْلَ فَلَقِ الصُّبْحِ, that he would not see a dream except for that dream would manifest itself in the morning like the rising of the sun. And something about Aisha radiallahu anha, if you ever find yourself in a place where you are learning about hadith in depth, where you're learning about hadith sciences in depth, pay very careful attention when you see a narration from Aisha radhiallahu anha. Something that is very beautiful about her narrations is she was a master at language. So when she would describe things that happened during the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ, she was very particular about her language. She even has collection of poetry in her name as well. She was very, very masterful when it came to Arabic language. So this term that she uses, falaq al-subh, right, at the breaking of the dawn, it's so beautiful. So beautiful, why? Because someone like her doesn't use words accidentally. They're very purposeful. Because every night when someone goes to sleep, what's one thing that you trust? If I wake up, what's one thing that would trust that will happen in the morning? The sun will rise, right? The sun will rise. The moment it rises from the west, that's a bad sign, right? But it will rise. Every day it will rise. So she's saying that the dreams that the Prophet ﷺ were having closer to revelation were like the break of dawn in the terms that it was certain it was going to happen the next day. Right? It was certain, just like the sun rises the next day in terms of its certainty, it's going to rise the next day. Right? So it's very beautiful, right? So the Prophet ﷺ became so in tune with his dreams that he trusted that they would manifest themselves like the sun in the sky. Right? The sun also, as well, has no ambiguity when it's risen. It could be a cloudy day, and you may or may not see the moon. Correct? If the moon's out, if it's a cloudy day, you might see the moon, you might not see the moon. But if it's a cloudy day and the sun is out, you know the sun is out because it's bright outside. It's light. So there's no ambiguity whether the sun was there or not, right, in terms of its visual. So, just like that, because the moon can have ambiguity, you may see it, you may not see it, but the sun has no ambiguity, you know if it's in the sky. Just like that, the dreams have no ambiguity either, right? So very beautiful language here. Sometimes people say, for example, oh, I made istikhara and I had a dream. What does this mean? There's ambiguity here, right? Istikhara, also known as the marriage dua, right? It's the only time people use it for some reason. But, yeah. And they expect, istikhara, you see a dream and then that's how I figure out my solution. But that's not necessarily true, right? We've done a class about istikhara before, almost a year ago. So maybe we'll do another one sometime. But this purpose of istikhara is actually is misunderstood many times because people think that it's like the first part of the process. It's actually like the last part of the process. It's when you've already made a decision and you're just wanting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to facilitate it for you, / keeping your heart firm and comfortable with the decision that you have made. There's a whole other few steps that you kind of have to take, right? And they don't manifest themselves in a dream or a vision or a sign like that. Rather, it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala placing an inclination in your heart towards going through with the action or not. Wallahu ta'ala alam. So, Aisha radhiallahu anha is saying that the manifestations of a dream became so clear, right? Also, another beauty here is that the sun rises gradually, right? So these dreams are like the rising of the sun. It will reach the highest point with Iqra, Bismi Rabbika alladhi khalaq. And then Aisha radhiallahu anha says, ثُمَّ حُبِّبَ إِلَيْهِ الْخَلَى. He began to like to spend time alone. He loved spending time alone. He was tired of the dhulm that was happening in the world. There was a lot of sickness, there was a lot of oppression, there was a lot of tribalism, there was just so much disease happening in the world. He just wanted to be alone and reflect. So he went into this spiritual retreat, almost like an i'tikaf. But at that time, the Arabs, they used to have this practice called tahannuth, where they would go seclude themselves for some time. So he went to this place called Jabal al-Nur, where there, inside Jabal al-Nur, there is a cave called Gharul what? Hira. Right? Famous cave. If you ever climb Jabal al-Nur, it's a tough climb. Right? It's a short climb, but it's pretty steep. Now, how did Rasulullah ﷺ find this cave? It's narrated that actually his grandfather, Abdul Muttalib, used to go there. So he used to see his grandfather go there, so that's how he knew where this cave was. Now, the first occasion when Rasulullah meditated in this tahannuth, this isolation, was during the month of Ramadan. Some scholars say it was about 2 years before the first revelation when he started doing the tahannuth. And this shows us what? That there's also a specialness to Ramadan even before Islam, even before Wahy. So what he would do is he would pack some food, pack some water, would go to the cave, whatever sustenance that he needs to survive some time there. And he would fulfill his responsibilities, and then he would go to the cave. And he would tell his wife, Khadija radiallahu anha, where he was going. So sometimes Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would run out of provision, so he would come back home, he would restock, he would fulfill whatever responsibilities he had to fulfill at the home or in the community, in the city, whatever he needed to whatever responsibilities he needed to fulfill, and then come back. Other times, Khadija radiallahu anha herself would know, based on the eating habits and the drinking habits and the consuming habits of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, she would know when it was time for him to restock. So she would go herself with the food, with the water, with the supplies, and climb all the way up to the mountain and give it to him, right? Which is so beautiful, because it shows what? It shows that Khadija radiallahu anha would see that the state of society was so heavy on the Prophet ﷺ, she wanted to do whatever she can to support him. Right? She wanted to do everything she can to show her love for him and be there for him. Some scholars say that Rasulullah ﷺ stayed in the cave for the entire month of Ramadan, and some say that he would stay part of the month until the supplies were exhausted. Some scholars even say that Rasulullah ﷺ didn't return to the cave until the following Ramadan, and he would wait in anticipation to go back. Then when the next Ramadan came, Rasulullah ﷺ packed his things and went back to the cave. Right? So in this cave, Rasulullah ﷺ spent a lot of time in personal reflection, a lot of time in connecting with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Other than that, the details of his schedule, what he did in the cave, how he would worship in the cave, did he fast, did he pray, what du'as he made, none of that is established anywhere. There are some Orientalists who have tried to kind of piece things together, but there's nothing really established anywhere in terms of our tradition. Now, but why was he here specifically in this cave, Ghar al-Hira? This cave has 2 openings. Right? If you ever go to the cave in Mecca, you'll see there's 2 openings. One of the openings is big enough for a person to enter. Just one person, maybe 2 small people. The other opening is very small, just big enough to let a light breeze in. And on the side of the small opening, there are some big rocks, so it gives kind of this feeling of like a private room. But what sealed the deal for Rasulullah ﷺ and why this part was so special is that whenever he would look out from the cave, he can see the Baytullah in the distance. He can see the Kaaba in the distance. Right? He had very sharp vision. Nowadays, you don't see the Kaaba at all. You just see clock tower, right? But at the time when there was a lot less, buildings there, you can see the Kaaba from that point. So he had very sharp vision in that regard as well. And he loved the Kaaba. He loved the Bayt of Allah. He loved the house that Ibrahim alayhi salam had built. So he was very comfortable in this spot. It was quiet. It was peaceful. There would be a breeze through the cave that would keep him cool. So the Prophet ﷺ would just sit there and look at this beautiful Kaaba, and it was a source of tranquility for him. He really found serenity and calmness there. Now what's interesting is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could have honored Rasulullah ﷺ in any corner of the world. Why this place specifically? Why this random cave in the middle of the desert? Why couldn't it have been one day he was sitting down and then a portal opened up, and when he walked through the portal, he found himself in this majestic world and revelation was given to him. That would be an epic story, right? Yeah, sure, it would be great. And it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He can do whatever he wants. He can reveal to him however he wants. But why this small place in the middle of the desert? Why? Now, wallahu alam, obviously, of course, but some scholars have given us some wisdoms that we may benefit from. And of these wisdoms is that great moments come with simplicity. Oftentimes we want to ask, how do I achieve the pinnacle of spirituality? What fancy dhikr do I have to make? What crazy ibadah that I have to do that no one has ever done before in order to achieve this great spirituality? Habibi, there's nothing like that. The greatest way to attain great spirituality is through the simple act of salah. The simplicity in ibadah is what leads to greatness. Right? And it's grand if you understand the meaning of salah. I want to do a class here one day where we just go through every word in salah. Every step by step. Every word that is said in salah, every dhikr that is said in salah, and just break it down meaning by meaning, significance by significance, so that one day we truly appreciate everything that is related to the act of salah. And so this greatness of Rasulullah ﷺ occurred when he was on this spiritual high, and it happened when he was alone in a place that was simple. Right? You want to be great? Erase yourself from the equation. Separate yourself from society. Remove yourself from the center of the world. In order for a great flower to grow or a tree with abundant fruit to grow, what has to happen first? The seed has to be buried under the earth, put away, erased from the equation, out of sight, isolated. And then there's a process that happens that allows it to grow. So the Prophet ﷺ, he erased himself from the community. He hit the mute button on the Netflix. He shut down his social media apps. He focused himself on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He focused himself on the greatness of Allah, how to cure the evils of society, a lot of reflection. And when we do this isolation, you'll begin to understand why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us in the first place. وَمَا خَلَقَتِ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. Nothing else becomes relevant after that. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created jinn and mankind in order to worship Him. That's it. It's that simple. وَهُوَ الْقَاهِرُ فَوْقَ عِبَادِهِ وَهُوَ الْحَكِيمُ الْخَبِيرُ. He reigns supreme over all creation, and He is the all-wise and all-aware. He reigns supreme over all ideologies, over all oppressors. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, هُوَ الْقَاهِرُ فَوْقَ الْعِبَادِ. He is the only one that matters, right? The only one worthy of worship. So when you disconnect from people and you connect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, your heart will begin to beat in remembrance of Allah when you go back to the people. So now when you're engaging in talks with people, even the Prophet ﷺ engaged in normal talks. Not every time the Prophet ﷺ engaged in conversation with the Sahaba, it was only about deen. They talked about worldly stuff too. But the difference is that with the Sahaba and the Rasulullah ﷺ is even while they were talking about the worldly stuff, they were so spiritually in tune that their hearts were still connected to Allah the entire time. Right? Our difficulty is that we've separated it. That when we're in the worldly, we're in the worldly. And then we have to separate ourselves from the worldly to achieve the spiritual. And that's okay, right? That's kind of the state of most people and just how kind of life works. But the idea is we want to try to attain that high spirituality the Prophet ﷺ attained, even though we know that no one will ever be able to reach his status, but he is our example. He is our example, so we want to try. And in that trying, in that sincere effort of trying, maybe that's our way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala showing us His mercy on the Day of Judgment and putting us with the Prophet Muhammad sallam and his ummah on the Day of Judgment. It's important to learn to be alone with your thoughts, right? Learn to be in the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Learn to focus. Learn to be quiet. It's important that we stop entertaining ourselves every second. You know, when someone has like a drug addiction and they separate themselves from the drug addiction, what happens? There's like withdrawals. It's very difficult for them. It's a very hard process to overcome an addiction. But like today, what's even more common than drug addiction is we've become social junkies. Right? Social media everywhere. And our ibadah has become a show. We're at Umrah doing tawaf, and instead of making dua, we're live streaming it. Right? Or in Ramadan, we're more worried about the aesthetics of the masjid than we are about the actual salah. Or, we'll complain, or I will complain. I'm not pointing fingers at it. This is just I'm just talking about myself here. I'll complain for an hour and a half. I have to stand for an hour and a half. But then when I scroll on social media, I can do that for 3-4 hours, no problem. But if it means my salvation, the nights of Ramadan, man, those are the nights where salvation happens. Those nights. I'm being asked to stand for an hour, hour and a half, and now I complain. Right? Or Quran. Right? Quran. Trying to engage with the Quran as much as we can without making it a show. Right? And it's part of the social media that we have. We want to learn how to separate ourselves from that. Which is actually, subhanAllah, I was thinking about how the nations of the past, they used to fast too, but they didn't refrain from food and water. What did they refrain from? Anybody know? Speech. Yes, correct. Right? So, for example, Zakaria alayhi salam, when he received news that he was going to have a son, he asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for a sign. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told him what? أَيَّتُكَ أَلَّا تُكَلِّمَ النَّاسَ ثَلَاثَةَ أَيَّامٍ إِلَّا رَمْزًا. You don't talk to anybody for 3 days. I don't talk to anybody for 3 days. So, it's interesting that there's this idea of just secluding yourself. Right? One of the best ways we can seclude ourselves, because, that's the question, how do we seclude ourselves? We go home, there's all these distractions. We go to work, there's distractions. We go hang out with friends. Like, when do I actually seclude myself? One of the best ways, honestly, is try to go hiking. I'm serious, right? By yourself, though, not with a group, right? Although going with a group is great, alhamdulillah, just go by yourself. Try hiking by yourself. Around that sunrise time when nobody else is there. Right? No one else is very early in the morning. No one else is there. You go, you just hike, you just engage in nature. You look at the beautiful water, the beautiful sky, the beautiful trees and mountains, and you just reflect on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Any void that we have in our life, it can only be filled through the remembrance of Allah. Right? It's hard though, because the reality is we don't like to face ourselves. Because when we face ourselves, we realize our flaws. There will be a reality of emptiness, a reality of mistakes, a reality of, you're ever just sitting there at night, can't go to sleep, and remember that cringy moment that you had in like 3rd grade, you just can't get out of your head. Those things happen, right? So it's those things that we're scared to face those realities. We're scared to have that reflection. We're scared to acknowledge that I have mistakes and that I need to rectify myself and I need to be better at certain things. I need to spiritually get better. But this is particularly important right now, and I'll tell you why. Right now, with the plights that is happening in the Muslim world, with Gaza being bombed, Syria and Lebanon are now being bombed too by the Israeli oppressors. The Muslim status in India, their oppression that's going on there, Kashmir, Sudan, right? Afghanistan earthquake, Morocco still recovering from their earthquake, Turkey is still recovering from their earthquake that happened almost a year ago. Our feeds are constantly flooded with information on these things. I realized, especially when the Gaza stuff has been happening the first week or so, the first few days, I'm just scrolling and scrolling and scrolling because I'm trying to find news after news. I'm trying to find update after update, see what's going on every second. And before I knew it, 3-4 hours went by. And I'm just looking at myself and I'm like, I swear that felt like 30 minutes, if that. And it's important to engage. It's important to engage. Now more than ever as well, because there's a misinformation war that's going on. So the likes that we do, the shares that we do, the posts that we do is our small effort in trying to raise awareness. But we also need to build time in our schedule where we just drop it all. Right? And again, this is a reminder to myself first, by the way. Anybody that knows me personally know that why this is a reminder to myself first. You need to just drop it all. Seclude ourselves for the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because that's actually when change happens. Right? Tahajjud is when greatness occurs. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy descends in the lowest heavens in the last third of the night, seeking those who are calling and begging for His mercy. The Prophet ﷺ told us that there are 3 people in which their du'as are never turned back. The first one is as-sa'im hatta yuftar, that a fasting person until he breaks his fast. Fasting person until he breaks his fast. So if we're saddened by what's going on in Gaza and other places in the world, seeing our brothers and sisters barely have anything to eat or drink, if it doesn't motivate us to maybe fast and not eat and drink ourselves so that we can make dua and it will be accepted, then we've kind of missed the point. Because in our efforts, we also want to have ibadah attached to our efforts. Just like Rasulullah ﷺ would make dua the entire night before a battle, but then when it came time for the battle, he was in it, doing the actions. Actions and ibadah. Right? If the situation of our brothers and sisters isn't causing us to wake up in the middle of the night and pleading to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for help and assistance, then what are we doing really? Because when those moments of greatness occur, that's where we want to be. That's why Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, rahimahullah, when he first took over the Muslim army, became the general, the first thing that he did is he got rid of everybody that was committing sin, openly committing sin, and then he made it a requirement for the entire army, you have to pray tahajjud before battles. Because that's when the greatness occurs. That's when the assistance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes. That's when the victory comes. And then the action that we do the next morning is backed by that ibadah. Right? And then the Prophet ﷺ told us that a just leader, al-Imam al-Adil, a just leader, their dua is never returned or turned back or rejected. And then the last one, and most importantly, right, which is very relevant, is the zalim, the mazlum, the supplication of the oppressed. And it says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala raises that dua above the clouds, and the gates and the heaven open up for that dua. The dua of the oppressed. Right? And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala responds and says, by my might, I will surely help you in due time. This is the most important part here. وَلَوْ بَعْدَ حِينٍ. Right? In due time. Your victory will come. It may not come when you want it to come, but it will come. And in Surah Isra, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that the victory of Al-Aqsa will come. Because Surah Isra tells us that the nation that is currently oppressing the Palestinians will have control over that land 2 times. The first time already happened, and this is the second time. And each time Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in Surah Al-Isra that the Muslims will come victorious, both times. So this is the second time that it's happening, which means the Muslims will be victorious. Right? We know that. We already know that. So we're going to do our part. We're going to do whatever effort, even if it feels futile, we're going to do it all. I'm going to sign every petition. I'm going to post every post. I'm going to share everything. I'm going to raise awareness as much as I can. I'm going to go to every protest. I'm going to call every Congress member. Now, somebody might sit here and argue, it's like, oh no, this is not the most effective thing. And it doesn't matter. The point is that I'm doing everything that I can within my capability. So that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks me on the day of judgment, what did I do to help these people? I can say, I did whatever I could do. Just like the frog or the bird, when Ibrahim alayhi salam was being thrown into the fire. There was frogs and birds that would gather water in their mouth and try to spit it into the fire. And the fire was huge. It was a massive fire. And so that little water, it's not going to do anything. It's not going to do anything. But I want to be in the position of that frog and the bird that on the day of judgment I say that when your beloved servants were being thrown into the fire or being bombed, I did whatever I can do to stop it. Right? So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he reaches the pinnacle of ibadah in that cave. Then, while he's in the cave, one day, an angel approaches him. And looking at the cave, he sees Jibreel alayhi salam. He always knew this day would come. You know, his mother had told him that he was special. Trees were saying salam to him. Clouds were shading him. This moment was coming, and he always knew it. There's a narration, Mustadrak Imam al-Hakam says that it was written on the Arsh of Allah. This narration has some weakness, but the gist of the narration summary says that Adam alayhi salam was making dua for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for years after his mistake. And then one day he said, I ask you for forgiveness through the name of Muhammad. So Allah asked him, how do you know Muhammad? And he says that when my soul was blown in, when I stood straight, I saw it written on your arsh, La ilaha illallah, Muhammad Rasulullah. So up until this point, if we're immersing ourselves in the seerah and we're in the footsteps of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and in the footsteps of the Arabs 1,400 years ago, right now, La ilaha illallah has been established. Right? It has been established. Now, not very many people follow it, but it's been established. But what has yet to be established is Muhammad Rasulullah. He still hasn't given that crown yet, but he's just about to receive it. So this is an orphan who is sitting in the cave. And in that scenario, the greatest moment ever on earth occurs. How many angels must have been waiting for this moment? No creation will ever be more beloved to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so for 600 years, the doors of revelation were closed. And those doors are being opened again. And up until this point, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had lived a full life. He had a family. He built a home. He was working. He was a very intelligent, successful businessman. Married a great woman. One of the greatest women to ever exist, Khadija radhiallahu anha. Raising their kids. But then after living that life, he decided that he now needs to point his attention towards his society. So he became socially active, taking part in the Hifz al-Fudul, taking part in the renovation of the Kaaba, and then seeking that isolation so that he can reflect on life and reflect on how to better his community. And so Jibreel alayhi salam places upon him a crown of prophethood and says to him the kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and says, Iqra. And this was the first of the two occasions in where the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ would see Jibreel in his true form. Jibreel's feet were slightly above the ground and his head was all the way up in the clouds. He had 600 wings and he only opened 2 of them and it covered the entire horizon from the east to the west. Rasulullah ﷺ, he recalled that I looked to the left and all I could see was Jibreel. I looked to the right and all I could see was Jibreel. I felt so overwhelmed that I looked up to the sky and wanted to see the open sky and all I could see was Jibreel. He crowded everything. And so on a Saturday night, during Ramadan in Ghar Hira, the Prophet ﷺ saw a light and then he heard a sound, but nothing came out of it. And the same thing occurred the next day. And then the following day, on a Monday in Ramadan, Jibreel alayhi salam appeared. And we know this because the Prophet ﷺ was later asked why he fasts on Monday. And he says, I was born on a Monday and revelation began on a Monday. So on a Monday in the month of Ramadan, Jibreel alayhi salam says to the Prophet ﷺ, Iqra. And now the journey starts. And Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he says, Ma ana biqari'. I need more time to prepare. I understand what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants me to do. He says what? I cannot read. I am not a reader. I understand I must sacrifice and spread the word of Allah and show the world what love is, show what mercy is, show what justice is, to bring human beings into Jannah and guide them, including those in Seattle, Washington. And that task is very big. And then Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says, فَأَخَذَنِي فَغَطَّنِي حَتَّى بَلَغَ مِنِّي الْجُهْدِ. He grabbed me and he squeezed me so tight that I could hardly bear the squeeze. And then he released me. Now, one beautiful thing here that the scholars say, this signifies ilm travels from heart to heart. Right? Ilm travels from heart to heart. Not from book to book, but heart to heart. Having a teacher is so crucial to the ilm. It's so crucial to gaining knowledge. And then he says it again, Iqra. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is saying, Ma ana biqari'. But Jibreel alayhi salam is his teacher. Jibreel alayhi salam is his teacher, so he knows he can do it. He knows he can do it, he's just being humble. So he grabs him and he squeezes him again. And then again it happens a third time. Iqra, ma ana biqari. I don't read. And then he squeezes him a third time. And this whole physical interaction was part of the preparation of divine revelation. Spiritual preparation occurs through physical activity. Look at Hajj. It's probably the peak of people's spirituality in their lifetime. It's a very physical activity. Fasting is the time of the year when we are at our highest in spirituality. And it is what? It's a physical activity. It's a physical activity. Even making wudu and performing salah, it's a physical activity. It's not, we don't just close our eyes and it just happens, right? There's a physical aspect to it. But also, that pressure that was being applied to the Prophet ﷺ, it says that people don't get into a high point overnight. A person needs to develop. A person doesn't just run 10 miles overnight. They need to push themselves over a long period of time to do that. So when Jibreel alayhi salam would tightly hug the Prophet ﷺ, at first he would resist, but then he would eventually give in. My brothers and sisters, giving in to Allah is key. Letting yourself go to Allah is so key. That's what our fitrah inside of us wants. But it's our nafs that holds us back. It makes us resist. But spiritually speaking, sometimes we need to be broken in. We need to break in. We need to break our nafs. We need to push back and resist and then just let ourselves go to Allah. A great example of this is actually Umar ibn Khattab. It was very difficult for him to come to grips with Islam. He had to be broken in. But eventually when he let go, he became great. He became amazing. And we'll talk about his conversion in detail. But it shows us that sometimes you need to be broken in and allow yourself the breathing room as well, which is why Jibreel alayhi salam would also what? Let go of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam momentarily before telling him to read again. So now, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is at the peak of his spiritual condition. And it's at this point that Jibreel alayhi salam gives the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam his first revelation. Now scholars have discussed why Jibreel alayhi salam squeezed the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and why he did it so tightly. There's no definitive answer, but some I mentioned previously and some others that were also mentioned, is some assert that it was done to show the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that he was not dreaming. This indeed was a reality, to show that this is real. Others suggest that Jibreel alayhi salam was indicating to the Prophet ﷺ how heavy this revelation is going to become. إِنَّ سَنُلْقِي عَلَيْكَ قَوْلًا ثَقِيلًا. That we are about to send upon you a very weighty, a very heavy revelation, a very tough task. Other scholars opt for a more symbolic explanation, like Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani stating that the 3 squeezes refer to 3 major trials that the Prophet ﷺ would experience but ultimately survive. And said that that's the boycott in Mecca that lasted for 3 years. In which they didn't have any food, they didn't have any water, people were dying, children were crying, children were dying, and it happened for 3 years straight. Right? But they persevered, and they came through at the end of it. There was the assassination attempt during the Hijrah of migration, and then the Battle of Uhud. All 3 events, we will talk about those in detail as we get to them. It's also mentioned in Imam Bayhaqi's Ad-Dala'il al-Nubuwah that this is where the Prophet ﷺ had his chest opened again. Right? Although there is weakness to this, so it's not a commonly held position, the authentic is that the Prophet ﷺ's chest was opened twice in order for his heart to be cleaned. Right? The first one happened when he was what? Very young, like 4 years old, correct, right? With Halima Sa'diyah. The second one, which is weakly narrated, is that when he was about 10 or 12 or right before puberty. The third time is right here, also weakly narrated, but it is narrated, which is right before the first revelation. And the fourth time is, which is authentic. So 2 are authentic and 2 are weak. The fourth one being authentic is when? Isra wal Mi'raj. Yes, correct, right? Tamam. So then Jibreel alayhi salam, he says to him a 4th time, Iqra. But before the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam can even respond, he says, Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq. خلق الإنسان من علق. اقرأ وربك الأكرم. الذي علم بالقلم. علم الإنسان ما لم يعلم. Iqra, read. in the name of your Lord who created. This word iqra, it has two linguistic meanings. One is to read and the other is to recite from memory. So when Jibreel alayhi salam commanded iqra, the Prophet ﷺ understood the former. Right? I can't read because he was unlettered. He didn't learn how to read and write. Which is actually a hujjah for him, not against him. Right? A proof for him, not against him. And so Jibreel alayhi salam actually intended the latter. Because the recitation will be in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Jibreel alayhi salam responds with what? Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq. This B, right, the letter ba here, is commonly translated as in. So in the name of your Lord. Read in the name of your Lord. However, it can also mean by. So read by the name of your Lord. By Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's help and permission. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then ends this first sentence with khalaq. Created. Because He created everything. خَلَقَ الْإِنسَانَ مِنْ عَلَقٍ. He created mankind. Telling the Prophet ﷺ what? That I can create from nothing. This magnificent creator, He's the one commanding you to recite. So iqra. And it's then repeated again intentionally. اقرأ وَرَبُّكَ الْأَكْرَمِ. Right? And read in the name of your Lord who is the most generous. Right? So the first iqra was for knowledge of the Quran. Some scholars say that the first iqra was for knowledge of the Quran, which is why it talked about things that are outside of this world. And then the second is for knowledge of this world, which is why the verse following the iqra wa rabbuka al-akram is what? الَّذِي عَلَّمَ بِالْقَلَمِ, the one who taught by the pen. عَلَّمَ الْإِنسَانَ مَا لَمْ يَعْلَمْ, taught humanity what they knew not. And with that, the clock of nubuwah starts. 40 long years of the Prophet ﷺ's life. All this time building up. It is now time for him to become a Nabi and become a messenger of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and become a Rasul. And all the weeks and weeks and weeks that we have been sitting here studying the childhood, the teenage years, the young adult life, the adult life of the Prophet ﷺ, all leads to this very beautiful moment. The greatest moment in human history. The first time the Quran was revealed, and the culmination of the final message, and the greatest miracle to ever happen. The miracle that was preserved for centuries and centuries. The miracle that exists in this masjid. It's the greatest miracle. And it exists here in this masjid. And we recite it every single day. What an honor. What a beautiful moment. So this clock of Nubuwwah starts, and Jibreel alayhi salam is telling the Prophet sallam, you must now become a prophet. And we'll conclude here, inshallah, with that little cliffhanger. And we will continue next week. Jazakallah khair. Do we have any questions? You mentioned that the Prophet ﷺ would go to the cave during Ramadan and did so year over year. Did the Arabs observe a lunar calendar prior to Islam? Yes, they did. Additionally, is there evidence that the pre- or post-Islamic Arabs adjusted lunar calendar to keep in line with the Gregorian or solar calendar, also known as adjusting so that any given Islamic month would remain within a certain time of year, for example, spring or summer? Jazakallah khair. I'm not sure about that, but I know that the pre-Islamic Arabs used to change the lunar calendar when it suited them. So, for example, there are prohibited months in which there are months where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or you're not supposed to fight in, right? You're not supposed to fight in. So there are certain sacred months that the Arabs had where there were certain rules to be followed during those months. No fighting, and that was the major one. It was just no fighting, right? Because they did that a lot. However, sometimes, so let's say like, Dhul Hijjah would come, and there's not supposed to be any fighting during that time, or Muharram would come, there's not supposed to be any fighting at that time, and then they would just say like, instead of this time being Muharram, we're just going to call it actually Rabi' al-Awwal instead, so that we can fight, right? So they would do that, where they would kind of like switch the months around. And then it would get super confusing, because then they would have to like make up the month that they missed. I don't know, like, right? So that would happen. That would happen for sure. I also heard the read, Iqra, meaning read the signs in the world, skies, everything as a communication from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the creator. Jazakallah khairan. Yeah, it's beautiful. Beautiful, mashallah. All right, if there's no questions, feel free to come up. If you have any questions, I'll be here. I'll be hanging out, both men and women. You can feel free to come and ask any questions that you would like. And jazakallah khair. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun. Salaam al-mursaleen walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.